Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinksy, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can shoot an email to the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C. Actually, all of us on this podcast are in Washington, D.C., but because of social distancing measures, we're all in different locations. I'm joined by my colleague, senior editor Christopher Bedford, and our...
I'm not social distancing. Don't put me on that train.
Dude, I'm introducing Saagar. Saagar's intro. We're here with our friend Saagar Enjeti. He's a host of Rising on Hill TV and also the host of the Realignment podcast, which is excellent, and you should absolutely check that out wherever you get your podcasts. Saagar, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, good to see you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start off by asking you both to tell me why Google is a monopoly. This to me, because Saagar's here really to talk about the kind of big tech atmosphere that this country is marinating in as we head to the polls this election cycle. And when we talk to Saagar, I think it's always interesting to take a 30,000-foot view from the daily fray, right? Because the horse race pundits are super obsessed with what's happening, every single day on their Twitter feeds. But, there's a lot more going on when you zoom out to 30,000 feet. And I think the tech narrative is one of the most important ones to understand in all of this. So I want to begin by talking about monopolies in Google and antitrust legislation. And I want to talk to Chris and Saagar about, I want them to explain to me why Google is a monopoly, because I'm a skeptic, but they're both pretty woke on this.
So it's interesting, Emily. I don't necessarily agree with the Department of Justice. I actually think the DOJ may not have defined the terms that they should have. And we need to understand, though, that doesn't make Google less of a monopoly. And this is something I've talked with technologists and Silicon Valley people about. One of the interesting maxims in Silicon Valley is that monopoly is actually the most efficient form in terms of technology. That whenever you have a form of technology like search, right? Like nobody wants to use the second, the third, and the fourth best search engine. So on the internet, we're not talking about the baby bells, which this is a reference to the phone companies, where you have like regionalized phone companies, which are then all bought out and controlled by AT&T. That's not how the internet works. Like the internet is a single point of entry for all of us. That being said, that doesn't make Google not a monopoly. It just means that the internet is naturally maximizing for monopolies. So that makes the question of, what does that mean for policymakers, regulators, and others? Which is that if we have these natural monopolies in this space, we could make it a matter of government policy to say, okay, we accept that there is a natural monopoly in this space. There are some industries where that just is, like utility companies, right? In certain different states.
Railroads.
It's railroads, bingo, which is that there were a lot. So we had to talk a lot about railroad regulation and capping the prices in terms of oil gouging. And that was the whole John D. Rockefeller thing. So whenever we think about natural monopolies, the question is about the role of government there. And that's where I think I differ from the libertarians, where I'm saying, okay, well, if we have this natural monopoly in this space, and this is where I differ from the DOJ is like, Google is crushing search engine competition. I'm just frankly very skeptical that there's a lot of competition in search. I think we've had 20 years of search. And I think that their argument is that Google pays Apple billions of dollars a year in order to keep Chrome as the pre-installed thing on their device. I'd be like, look, that's not about search. That's about data. That's about, they want all of our data pouring into their servers. And that's what makes Google not a search company per se. It's the behemoth and the data farm that it is. And that just brings me back to, look, we can accept that there are natural monopolies in America. So then it comes down to the question of, what does that mean as a public that grants these natural monopolies in our marketplaces? Do we have certain rights as users, as American citizens, and more? And I think that's the more interesting debate.
And, even Friedrich Hayek would say, from the libertarian, classicist Austrian economics point of view, that there are natural monopolies that exist, exactly like you talked about with utilities, with railroads. But nobody who wants to grow up and be a CEO says, I want to grow up and be the CEO of Amtrak, because that's not a very great job. You probably have a short sleeve colored shirt and your tie on and no jacket, some dandruff. It's not being in charge of Cisco Systems. It's not being in charge of Google. It's a fine job, I'm sure. But the government's role at that point is to make those kind of sanctioned natural monopolies the public have decided are good for them to be at least the whipping boys of the marketplace. But let me give you guys a glimpse into just one facet of monopolistic behavior by Google that I experienced firsthand. When I joined online news media, there were vibrant sales teams. There would be a vice president of sales who had a nice home in the suburbs. Right. And there would be 3 or 4 young people and a couple middle-aged people, all kinds of people, all ages underneath them, who were making good money once they started to get clients. They're selling ads. This is back in the day when you would go to the Daily Caller or any other, The Hill, and you would see a beautiful ad campaign with the banners synced up with the top and a pop-up ad that asked you to sign something. Your computer didn't crash when you went to it. It made sense. Nowadays, you notice, all right, I go to the Caller, I go to Yahoo, I go to CNN.com, and my computer feels like it's going to die. It's going to have a cardiac arrest on the table right here. Everything's falling apart. My screen's going blue, and every ad is like, oh man, I looked at Brooks Brothers last week, and it knew that. Oh my gosh, I thought about taking my wife to dinner tonight, and it's advertising local dinner places. I don't even think I said that out loud. That's all these different networks that's pulling information and to put it on there. Now, those ads sell cheaply. Those ads sell for a portion of a penny on a dollar, and they're sold by these search engines that target you based on your innermost desires and deepest, darkest dreams. Any sales company, any news site much prefers to have the big, beautiful campaign, but there's a reason they don't have that anymore, because Google went in and undercut sales teams across the entire country. They said, why would you spend 5 cents a click with foxnews.com when I could sell you all of the innermost desires of every one of your clientele that's localized to their computer, not to their region, and pull it up for you for portions of a penny? That's why you see sales teams right now at a lot of major publications that aren't legacy publications that are maybe one person, maybe 2 people, and they're always stressed. They're always frantic, like a death of a salesman kind of thing, because Google undercut them. Now that's, fine, whatever. That's massive, unbelievable levels of competition and pressure brought to bear. But then what did Google do? Then Google turned around and said, places like the Federalist and other sites, we're going to take away your advertising. You can't advertise in our networks. So if you've got the global advertising market, drive it out of business, replace it with yourself, and then decide who's allowed on it. I mean, that's mark of the beast level corruption. That is absolute monopolistic behavior, and they could nail them to the wall on that. They do that they'll start doing that in your health. They'll start doing that in mental health. They'll start doing that in all of this data they're collecting on you. The idea that Google does not do evil is, in the words of Steve Jobs, bullshit.
Data is one thing, and this is actually a different conversation, but I think there needs to be much more research into the chemical addictions that these companies are knowingly foisting onto the public. We don't understand the extent of them yet, but it's literally making them rich. They're making us addicted, and they're making themselves rich, and it's destroying our culture, and that's not hyperbole. I think we all understand that after what we've endured in the course of this year 2020. I think the natural monopoly comments you guys both made were really helpful in this space. And one thing that is useful to think about, in my opinion, is how so many of these issues we have with big tech are downstream of their monopoly. And so if you're looking at it, I want to tie this into the story about the New York Post, because this is something that I actually think really is downstream of big tech's monopolization, right? Like Facebook needs to be a monopoly to succeed, because you need everybody on one place for their product to make any sense, right? Like,
then they can't sell your ad. Right. They would have a worse pitch to advertisers.
If you're not on Facebook, you're even real.
Yeah.
They'd have a worse pitch to advertisers, but it's also the point of going on Facebook is centralized social media updates from everybody you know. So if you have to go to 5 different places, it defeats the purpose of Facebook. Anyway, so that's an important element of this. But when we see what's happening with the New York Post, can you talk a little bit about how Facebook and Twitter's domination, Saagar, in their space allows them to get away with this nonsense?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the concept of what monopoly is and how kind of and how our forefathers kind of thought about it in the last 100 years or so, the last time there was a big monopoly movement, is they understood monopoly as a form of private government. And I actually think that's a very important concept to understand, because it means that you're making rules and regulations which have impact upon your users, but then it turns out that many of those users are like almost all American citizens. And that's where the content moderation standards become really important. So 4 in 10 Americans, 4 in 10, get all of their news primarily from Facebook. And then if you include Twitter in that, that's an extra marginal percentage. We don't actually know what that is, although, it's something like 2 to 10% of the population who get their news there. So you're talking almost here about 50% market penetration. So whenever that happens and they unilaterally decide through political motivation to slow down a story or block a story outright in the case of Twitter, which is directly harmful to the Joe Biden campaign, I can't help but think of that as an in-kind donation in the, hundreds of millions to the Joe Biden campaign. I don't see it any other way. And this, again, is where I think the private government standard comes into play, which is that these people are legislating. Like when they decide to block one story or not, they are actually having internal deliberation about what you and I get to see. Facebook is even more transparent about this. They have a board of governance, which is supposedly independent from Mark Zuckerberg, in which they decide whether things get blocked by, or slowed down or not. I don't know if that's what even happened in this case, which just, again, would go to show you that they don't have any real adherence to their own standards whenever it comes to stories like this. But what it means is that we need to be concerned about it. And I think that is where you can look at the FCC's decision on Section 230. I think Twitter and Facebook are directly responsible for this, where you had the FCC, which for a long time is very reluctant to move into this, saying, look, I think we're going to have some transparency whenever it comes to content moderation. So like, you guys have a First Amendment right to do whatever you would like, but in order to keep your legal right, in order to basically have legal protections from lawsuits and users and user-generated content, that means you're going to have to be transparent about what gets blocked and doesn't, and then stick to those standards. Because we all saw that Twitter just created this BS standard out of nowhere whenever it came to blocking the New York Post. And, that's the same standard that would have applied to the Pentagon Papers, Edward Snowden, Trump tax returns. Everybody's heard the spiel, but it's true. And we need to remember that. And so whenever they just come up with these things on the spot, these are violations as our rights as citizens, in my opinion. And I think that, again, when we're talking about citizenry, that's where the government starts to get involved. And I think we need to be more comfortable talking that way.
Now, Bedford, even if the Facebook were to be transparent about why things are blocked and who's doing the blocking, and they are kind of, because they also have, this is a good question for Chris, because he's been involved in the fact-checking process that Facebook relies on. This is still, I think they can actually still get away with their nonsensically biased hit jobs on conservative media and on important stories. I mean, I think we're getting to a point where if the New York Times had published what the New York Post published, hypothetically, it still would have been a problem. They would have blocked the Times story. I think this is really just concentrating power in the hands of the elites more and more. And as somebody who was actually involved in the fact-checking process, I mean, don't you agree? Because what you guys were doing when you were over at the Daily Caller News Foundation and running fact checks, you're a minority voice, and they can choose to listen to you or not, and the public still has no choice. I mean, we have a choice whether or not to use Facebook. That's I don't want to sound too much like Saagar here. Just kidding.
I just use it to keep in touch with older relatives.
Okay.
I think it's probably what it's used for these days. I'm sorry for that squeaking in the background. I have a 15-week-old animal that got loose, causing some trouble behind me that I think is all set.
You should mention what kind of animal it is, because
because that's a source of embarrassment. So it's a crocodile.
It's a squeaking crocodile.
I don't think they actually would have gone after the New York Times, because they all have a special club together where they don't attack each other, and they go after the populous places. I think they kind of underestimated that the New York Post is the third. They probably never read it, the people who work at Facebook, but they're the third highest circulated newspaper in the entire country. I mean, when I got a story on the cover of the New York Post, I think my family was more proud of me than at any point in my history. I have to have a couple of kids before I even come near to making up for that, because that's what they grew up with.
Don't bite your crocodile.
Oh, sorry. The fact checker thing is a complete crusher of information. For example, after the New York Post story came out, PolitiFact, which is a project owned by Poynter Institute, which is the fair and balanced arbiter of everything that's supposed to be fact-checked, they claimed that the story couldn't be verified by them because it wasn't borne out yet completely. Now imagine if you were the New York Post and you were trying to report Watergate, just to be cliche. And every single day you were putting out stories for 2-3 years, and you were getting fact-checked inconclusive because the story wasn't finished yet. I'm so glad that these adults, like they're actual adults too, aren't in charge of investigative reporting, because this is not how you investigate a story. You can't say it's not yet proven yet. It's about pointing together facts. And so far, it's kind of funny. It's showing itself to be proven. I was a little surprised at this tech world Pickett's charge on this Joe Biden story. I thought it was a very stupid time for them to attack, because to your point, Emily, they would have had a fact check up, calling it inconclusive and stopping you from reading it in about 6 more hours. And the story would not have had the readership. You wouldn't have had a 12% spike in subscriptions, a tripling of subscriptions, news subscriptions to the New York Post. This might not have become the international story or the national story it is, and they could have just dismissed it or ignored it the way that they so often do with major stories, even stories that have documents. They'll repeat unfounded stories over and over again, but not stories that have documents. And Facebook, to its credit a little bit, was beginning to crack down on some of this stuff because there was a racket going. You're paid to put up a fact check on Facebook if you're one of the approved fact checkers. There was a racket going on that they would say, well, this lacks the full scope of everything. This lacks context. Now, that allowed them to fact check false basically any political ad they wanted to, because in a 30-second ad spot, you're not going to get the full story and the Democratic side of things or the Republican side of things. Now, since fact checkers are obscenely corrupt, they would only really go after Republican ads. So fact check false, because it lacks the full context that PolitiFact or some dweeb in California decided that a candidate in Iowa needed to have on their opponent, their Democratic opponent. This is an absolute information crackdown. It's a monopoly attempted by this group to make it so that they're the arbiters of what is true and what you can say and what you can't say. Now, they were comfortable with this situation for a long time, the media. They were comfortable being the sole arbiters of truth. But what Facebook and Twitter did, which is kind of funny, they cucked them a little bit. They said, you know what, I can do this better than you. You're off. Why don't I just do it right now? I'll just throttle the traffic and see what happens. I think that was a mistake by them. But you see this pearl clutching and from the fact checkers. Their concern is not that the New York Post story was crushed. They're fine with that. Their concern is that it wasn't crushed by them.
Yes. So
it's still insidious and it's deadly because, I mean, PolitiFact doesn't have more power than the East India Trading Company like Google does or Facebook does. And it's not going to destroy your business, but it does hurt it to be fact-checked false. Them being cut out just lays this bare. I'm actually kind of surprised that in a time when they were hiding a senile candidate from the public and hiding his vice presidential candidate from the public as well, they would be so bold-faced on this and just pull back the curtain and say, here's what we're doing. We're stopping the story and release a statement. And even if they did release a statement, which they did, wouldn't, if you're at Facebook, say, why don't we have a Republican release this statement that we're throttling this? Why are we going to have a professional Democrat do it? That's how arrogant they've become. Yeah. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing for the American people to see this level of bias in the media and this level of censorship in the tech company, because it's always existed. And now they're so bold about it because Donald Trump, Orange Man bad, that they're just showing it to us.
Mm-hmm. So if we zoom back out, though, we're in this time where we were told, and this was around the same era when all of these tech companies were excessively optimistic about how they were building a more connected and compassionate globe. Laughable. Mm-hmm. But if we zoom back out, around that same time, the rise of blogging was happening, right? And like some of the best voices right now, Matt Taibbi and others, we were told that the democratization of media was underway, and it was creating a much fairer and much more transparent media ecosystem, so that when the New York Times screws up, there is a blogger to come in. There's a Tim Carney to come in and say, here's what's wrong with everything in the New York Post or in the New York Times article. And now we're in a period where that's true, and there's more people out there in new media right now grinding it and fact-checking the fact-checkers and just going on and doing the work to correct the record. But while we see that happening, we also see more power concentrating old guard. I mean, don't you think that's true? Are you like, I'm not optimistic at all right now. I don't know what the solution is. I just know that I think things are getting worse, not better. And that's interesting to me. There's a dissonance there, because you'd think things would be getting better as people in new media, like all of us, our voices are amplified and we're able to reach more and more people. But I kind of think, and this is different for you, Saagar, because you have a different show, I kind of think sometimes you're just reaching, by and large, the partisans who are consuming that anyway.
Yeah, it's a crazy dynamic, right? Which is that it's never been a better time to be independent and to start something new and get a big new audience, which is being underserved. And also the mainstream media is more powerful than ever. The New York Times is actually making more money than it ever has. They're doing bonanza. I actually think that this is both good and bad, in that the decline of advertising that Google and Facebook led means that every major national publication has to go subscription. Now, that means that how many things are you really going to subscribe to? Most people, like 2 or 3 max, right? So that means they're going to pay for a New York Times subscription.
The transom.
The transom, right? If you're conservative. But if you're like an upper middle class liberal, you're going to pay for the New York Times and the Washington Post. So this is a good thing and a bad thing for the Post and the Times, which is that they're making more money than ever, but they can't stray from the party line. This is what leads them to not even try and report on Hunter, to not even try and give any sort of semblance to Trump and others, which is that they have to stay true to their core brand and their core customer. But so in a way, they're becoming more partisan. They're taking the gloves off, which is also good for all of us. So I think we're like leading to the bastardization of media and the making it so that there is no longer like paper of record. Like people on the right don't even think that way about the New York Times anymore, right? Like we know exactly what they are and who they are and what they're all about. But here's the issue, which is concentrated capital is on the side of the New York Times and on the Washington Post. The richest and most powerful people among us don't even recognize that the paper of record, so-called, is just their paper. And that is leading to a dynamic where you just see a huge split in the media ecosystem. And I have no idea how it plays out, because the truth is that we're currently living in a world where Joe Rogan is a $100 million man and the New York Times is a multi-billion-dollar company. They're both very powerful, but they don't exist in the same space like whatsoever. I actually think this is probably a good thing. And in the long run, I think we're going to lead back to our original part of our history of yellow journalism. Everybody shits on yellow journalism, but I actually think yellow journalism is great. You know, it was the highest rated news, it's one of the highest times of news literacy in American history, because people actually like to get their news with a tint, so-called, of what they think in a partisan way. I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that, you know, the making of the objectivity media, which really was just like center-left media of the 1960s and 1950s, was bad for America, and it kind of led to where we are today. The only reason we can do currently what we do, all three of us, is because of the internet and because of this, and we have audiences outside of these gatekeeped like mainstream institutions. So that's a long answer to that question. I'm very conflicted. I really don't know.
That's true. That's the only reason we could do this for a living. Although I would still absolutely nuke the internet and save humanity if I could, and go back to Tendon Bar. I agree with you. That age of corporate journalism, where it was just the arbiter of truth and the one news channel. I mean, that was a short-lived kind of boomer thing that existed. Earlier, they were straight-up partisan papers. You still have them, at least existing by name. The whatever city Republican, the Jefferson City Democrat. I mean, these are just different newspapers that once were that party's paper, and you kind of had a good idea over what they were saying when you picked it up, and you try to read maybe multiple sources if you could, and have some news literacy. I'm concerned about the center-right media, to your point, especially right now, Jashinksy. 4 years ago, after Donald Trump won the election, I thought it was going to be a really interestingly ascendant time for conservative news media for a couple of reasons.
Same thing. Yeah.
Tucker Carlson and other people are now in charge of cable, and were absolutely leading. They've been doing it for some time with Sean Hannity. They had radio, obviously, with Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and some other ones. Magazines had begun to discredit themselves in some ways, but there was absolutely no competition between the New Republic still and National Review and the American Spectator and all of those different papers, Weekly Standard, most of which are gone now or on their way out. the online news media was a place of a huge amount of growth. And suddenly that was going to be a place where at the same time as the left-wing media had seriously discredited themselves and the American public showed that they were sick of the elites, we're going to have an unlimited amount of or significantly more access to the parties in power, the ability to get those stories, to get those scoops. And readers that the parties in power would be interested in, and readership that the advertisers would be interested in reading. I was wrong. It was because it was shocking how quickly in our metropolitan areas, what had been a joke 2 days before, wearing a red MAGA hat if you saw someone in the street, suddenly became a red armband and the sign that you were a neo-Nazi or a member of the party. The opposition went from people who thought Trump was a clown with bad ideas and redneck fans to someone who thought he was Hitler and that they were acting out some kind of play where they were, liberating Normandy Beach every day while getting their brunch. It was even the end of libertarians and conservatives and liberals who would very frequently get beers together, have happy hours together, get lunch together, make fun of each other, invite each other to each other's parties, go to each other's Christmas parties, Hanukkah parties, New Year's parties. That kind of ended. And
it's gone. Yeah.
It got to a point where a few years later, I was so missing it that I reached out to an old listserv. We used to have lunch and smoke cigarettes and drink beers once every few weeks. No one responded except for one guy who was at the Wall Street Journal and said, "Why are you emailing this list?" We used to get beers. We used to get lunch together. It was like 2 years ago. And I said, "It's been too long. Why don't we meet up?" And that was the only response.
However, it's Bedford.
Well, I mean, I am a difficult person to be around.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Too weird for his own friends.
It's a bit weird. I couldn't believe the ghettoization and what had originally been this place where if a conservative news media outlet broke something, they had the documents, they could prove it, other papers would be forced to contend with it. And they would say, well, this is a conservative publication, but these documents are interesting. And they would look at it. Now you could have a confession on videotape and documents and print something, and no one will pick it up. Exactly, no one cares. They just ignore it. And that level combined with advertisers not wanting to do things with you, parties drying up in DC, which I know it's stupid, it's the swamp, but like that's a moneymaker to have somebody sponsor an event or something for news media companies that are in the internet space. Have people come out to that. People stopped wanting to do business with you, stopped being seen with you, and started ignoring you. And that kind of suffocation has been very, very deadly. And then when Facebook and Twitter got cheered on for dropping them and Google demonetizing people, you can't make a living. So there are still some very interesting people like Matt Taibbi and Saagar, and what the Federalist is doing is wonderful. People who are frequently somehow moving into the heads of the left, and they feel like they need to attack us all the time. But it's largely a suffocating arena to be in, and it makes me concerned for what the future of free information is going to look like.
I want to move on to Jeffrey Epstein because both of you followed closely, and there's
my favorite.
Didn't kill himself.
As we're recording this, but I'm going to give a quick.
Some breaking news today, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I just want to be a pessimist once more and say I completely agree with both of you on all of this, that we do, as Saagar has said, fetishize the neutral media arbiters, that this idea that Walter Cronkite is going to tell you like it is and you can trust him. That's never been true. It used to be better. It's never really been true, and it's probably not healthy. I just don't know if the model of splintered and democratized media works, where we can go back to an era of yellow journalism for two reasons. One, when we still have those purported arbiters of neutrality, and two, when those people have their power concentrated and accelerated and growing because of big tech. So that's my sort of pessimistic counterpoint to all of this. Not that you guys necessarily disagree with that, but let's talk about the Ghislaine.
He's still alive, like kind of amazingly, right?
Very much still alive. What do you guys think? And I actually want to talk about this first in terms of the content of what we've learned that she has said, but then secondly, also in terms of, people always say that I'm crazy when I connect Epstein to the election, but, and I think this is probably an interesting thing that Saagar, you experience with your audience and your listeners, disenfranchised voters that pull the lever for Trump or stay home because they're mad they're not able to vote for Bernie and the DNC bulldozed him. These are people who actually have very legitimate reasons when we look at a case like Epstein to distrust elites.
Yes.
to stay home from the polls. What do these Epstein documents tell us about what was actually? What are we learning? I'll ask you that one, Saagar.
So I went through some of the documents today. Honestly, I'm a little disappointed. There weren't what they were purported to be. And just to explain for everybody who's listening out there, these are a private deposition that Ghislaine Maxwell gave in a case involving a woman named Virginia Giuffre. She's one of the most high-profile Epstein victims. She was, allegedly was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew and with Alan Dershowitz and with like a whole host of other very prominent individuals, former Prime Minister of Israel, Leslie Wexner, who's a Victoria's Secret billionaire, etc. Hedge fund managers, I can go on. I have them all. So the key to understand about this deposition is that she was basically asked on the record for hundreds and hundreds of pages, like, do you recall, forcing Virginia Giuffre in order to have sex with Prince Andrew? Do you recall Bill Clinton being on Epstein's private island? She says 1,000% that didn't happen. I don't think that's true, given some of the other testimony that we have from people who were on the island. I actually want to bring it back to what you said, which is that I think people get too obsessed with the specific details of the Epstein case. And I'm not saying they're not important, and every victim out there, I've actually even spoken to some, it's horrible what they had to go through. I like to think of it in the context of this broader corrupt system, which, like you said, what if these people will overlook Epstein? What is all the other stuff that we don't even know about? I mean, I read the most concerning document surrounding Epstein is from the New York State's the Financial Bureau. I forget what I think it's called it's not called FinCEN, but it's NYFS or something like that, Financial Bureau or something. They have an internal report of Deutsche Bank and how they pursued Epstein as a client from 2013 onwards to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in money management, knowing he was a convicted pedophile, knowing that he was violating the law on several occasions in terms of his cash withdrawals, which should have prompted calling the FBI, knowing that he was sending settlements to Eastern European human trafficking rings, knowing that he was illegally entering into these non-disclosure agreements. Again, they knew all of this, and it went up to the highest levels of the bank, and the bank was like, nah, we're good. Like they violated, the New York State Financial Bureau actually found that they violated their own internal rules around money laundering and about client protection in keeping Epstein as a client. And I'm like, how does that happen? And I see that in the context of, I don't know if you guys saw these. This is from BuzzFeed News called the FinCEN files. I've been kind of obsessed with this. So the FinCEN
did a good post on it too.
Yes, he did. And the FinCEN files are these documents which banks are required to file by law with the Department of Treasury over a suspicious transaction. As long as they file that, they actually cover their ass. They can't get in trouble. So, but what it has is this loophole where all of the criminality of the world's oligarchs and of Wall Street and all that is sitting in the Department of the Treasury. But, we couldn't get our hands on it. They got their hands on some. And it's when I saw that the network of, hundreds of billions, probably in the trillions of dollars, that's moving around legally through the global financial system and with their complicity, that I began to really understand Epstein. Because Epstein is entering into negotiations with Bill Gates, with Leon Black. I mean, Leon Black is the head of Apollo Group. He's one of the titans of Wall Street. Is $9 billion. He was revealed by the Times. This was just last month. I mean, wiring the man tens of millions for consulting services for no particular reason. He'd known him for 25 years. Actually, the transactions, right? The transactions began the year that he visited his private island. And I mean, look, you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but it's here. It's documented, right? And this is just one billionaire. How many more are out there? We only know this because somebody in Deutsche Bank gave some records over to the Times and leaked it. So I like to think of him in terms of a much bigger, dynamic, corrupt system. And that's actually what scares me more than anything, because I'm like, if they can overlook Epstein, there's so much more that's going on out there.
And let me throw a question to you, Chris, that kind of ties this whole conversation together, which is that we remember when it was actually a Project Veritas video of the ABC, I believe, anchor talking about how this woman was exasperated. She was like,
Amy Robach was her name.
Amy, yeah. And she's talking about how she's like, I had it all. All of the stuff on Epstein. She's like, I had it years ago. They didn't run it. Now, Saagar just mentioned the Deutsche Leak that published in the Times. I don't know if the Times would have published that a few years ago. What do you think? What do you think about that? What do you think?
I think they might have probably still published that a couple of years ago, but we would not have been able to draw it together the way that Saagar just did. And this is a huge problem because, and this is, I think, to your point, part of the election, part of the us versus them and the elites versus the workers and those who've been left behind. If I tried to break the law trafficking with $100,000 or laundering it, they would shut down my account and they would probably report me.
No question.
Now, if I did that with $100 million, they wouldn't. Right. They would just take the money and say, go on your way. They were doing this. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein is not, he's in a league of the worst people on the planet. Because, I mean, you have these cartels that are taking women apart bit by bit on camera and leaving them in the desert. And they're using Deutsche Bank and they're using other banks. They're using major banks. Wells Fargo, I think, is one of the ones that's mentioned. I'm not positive on that. But there's all the banks that you would know are trafficking for these criminals in huge amounts of cash for profit and completely ignoring it and not reporting it upward and not doing anything about it. I mean, it gets to a point where you want to call something a vast right-wing conspiracy this, you want to call something a vast conspiracy that. But the idea that the billionaire class of the planet, the possible presidents, sitting U.S. senators, and a freaking member of the British royal family, a prince, were going to a satanic sex island that trafficked in women and were getting bribed all across the planet by a guy whose basic only thing is trafficking in women. And that's true. So once you realize it's true, it's like, okay, what's next? 2020? It's hard to follow anything after that or believe anything after that because the worst fears are true.
You know, and one thing I have a really hard time with, not just in the corporate media, but also just with people who are sort of Twitter pundits and even like in positions of power in conservative media. It's like QAnon nuts. QAnon is nuts, right? Like it's Pizzagate's crazy, but people, one of the biggest biases in media is frankly just that people who are in media are political obsessives. They're in the know. They don't understand what it's like to be a disenfranchised person in flyover country. I remember being a person exactly like that. And you can understand how when things like Epstein happen, people are attracted to QAnon and there are different levels of interest.
That was that one voice that's been saying that there's an international ring of sex traffickers involving the King of England. So.
I mean, it's like, this is like fulfilling their exact skepticism. That's absolutely not true. Comment ping pong is fine. But you know, this fulfills the sort of like broad narrative that they think is happening.
Yeah. I mean,
Pizzagate.
Yeah. It's very important to understand. I try to tell people this. I was on the phone with somebody the other day and they were like, oh, QAnon, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, look, man, I don't want to hear it from somebody who belongs to a party that, I mean, Russiagate is just birtherism, right? Like, it's the same level of like connective tissues, like the P-tape and all that. It's exactly the same. I mean, it's a slightly higher IQ, but like, it's the same thing functionally. And that's kind of how I've been thinking about QAnon as well, which is you have all these reporters and others like, this is so dangerous, blah, blah. Look, I mean, they just hold these people in contempt. That's the truth. They hold old people, Trump voters in particular, and old white voters the most in absolute contempt. They despise them. Anything.
It's also Trump-loving millennials who QAnon hits, and they do. It is exactly true, and that's why there's disproportionate coverage of QAnon. And you look at polls about how many people actually know what the hell QAnon is.
Most people don't even know what it is. Most Republicans don't even know what it is. Okay, that's the key. That's the key part. Like you said, there's probably more liberals who know about QAnon than actual conservatives who do know about QAnon. The whole like anti-QAnon stuff is mostly bullshit. Like just
it's like the idea that this is a white power symbol. And
exactly.
There's like a cartoon frog that's actually a secret Nazi symbol. And then it's clowns on Twitter are Nazis. Like, you're clowning me, bro. These are the same people that was it a article in Politico? It was picked up. I know it was picked up by Politico, picked up across the entire press about a little over 4 years ago now, that said the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis were distributing marijuana cigarettes in poor neighborhoods to discourage black voters. Now, that's a racist story. Like, just hand out weed so black people don't vote. And the idea that the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis are like these two powerful organizations that are around every corner. I mean, the Antifa was chasing them for 3 straight years before they finally found them in Charlottesville. The idea that there are these all-powerful organizations on the right, and that all this stuff is real, and that QAnon is actually in charge. These are really deeply stupid ideas. And you have to not be surrounded by anyone from outside of your like small social circle and political belief to never even be questioned on it, to never say, does this sound true on its face? Are there literally Twitter clowns chasing me? And is that the Third Reich? Is there QAnon pulling the strings on the president? I don't think it takes a smart person to have at least a little bit of doubt on that, but they don't. They just run with it, and their friends nod and they say that's really intelligent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracy mongering on the left. I was going to mention the Sheldon Whitehouse with his Charlie Day chart of the Federalist Society to Amy Coney Barrett to Bradley Foundation money to wherever. I mean, it's laughable, but
that was kind of true.
I was going to say, let's be honest.
I was like, they just nailed him.
Let's be honest, Emily. It's all true. It's mostly true.
Right, but it's not. Yeah. It's like it's not a grand conspiracy.
It's not nefarious, but like it's true. Like.
It's like conservatives want like originalist justices, so they're going.
Yeah.
These organizations
a couple organizations that work together to groom conservative justices and then push them forward.
Yeah, it's not like smoke. Anyway, so to bring this conversation full circle, I want to talk about how right now we're a couple of weeks before the election. People are already voting, and we have this Epstein doc dump, and then we also have the Hunter Biden story, which we've talked about, kind of the secondary media story of it, because that's arguably as important as the actual Hunter Biden story. But voters in the country right now are marinating in this atmosphere of Epstein and of what the Trump campaign refers to as the Biden crime family. But legitimately, if you dig into Hunter Biden's financial ties, like we've talked so much about Ukraine, his financial ties to the Chinese government.
Way worse, in my opinion.
Are they not way worse?
It's way worse. Yeah. No, I mean, I've tracked Hunter since I call myself a Hunter originalist. I was actually one of the first people to ever interview Peter Schweitzer and put him on the air about this story over a year and a half ago.
So you're
and I always found, I actually think they made a huge mistake. A lot of people by going and talking about the Ukraine stuff. I think the China story is so much worse. Hunter on Air Force 2 goes to China, seals a deal with the Chinese business partner for a private equity firm to the tune of $1.5 billion, owns a 10... Sorry, say that again?
He was on a vice presidential trip.
Yes, he was. Joe Biden took him on Air Force 2 to Beijing. He's staying in the hotel, introduces his dad to his business partner. This is all in the New York Times. You can go read this. Like, has a handshake, whatever, with his business partner. His business partner gets them a Chinese government finance deal for $1.5 billion. He continues to own 10% of this company, by the way. He's like, I walked away from the board. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. He has a financial stake in this company. $10 billion.
Like he was an active governor anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like he's an active person.
What does Hunter say? Get him on the line.
This fund invests in an app which they use to keep Uyghurs in concentration camps. Okay, this is all public record. It's all out there. And I mean, that's the Rosemont Seneca Partners. That's the firm, and the BHR Holdings, which is the company that he founded in China. And you look at the Senate Intelligence Committee report, and we're talking about a $1 million something slush fund for him and his brother, where they're buying themselves MacBooks and airplane tickets. It's outright. It's right there in the open. And then with the most recent developments in the story, it's like moving so fast. We have his business partner who is saying basically that he's like, yeah, I worked on some of these Chinese deals with Hunter. Joe Biden was the quote unquote the big guy referred to in emails that was getting kickbacks from this deal. And the only reason these deals are being entered to is because they want to purchase political influence. It's the Clinton Foundation all over again. I mean, I remember, I think I wrote the story almost exactly 4 years ago. It was the first story I ever wrote that Trump tweeted out about that Moroccan king who donated like $15 million to the Clinton Foundation. And he was basically in his email was like, I don't care about the Clinton Foundation. He's like, I just want to meet Hillary Clinton before she becomes president. It's like it's just spelled out in the open. I think that's the same thing that was happening here. It's just, it's horrible. And I just want to end with this. Biden says, he literally says that the report itself, that all these allegations we just went through, which are public record, are not true and disproven. He's willing to go further than Hunter. Even Hunter is like, yeah, it's true. And I wasn't qualified to sit on those boards. He said it himself. I mean, he's just outright lies about this every single time he's asked about it. I'm sure he's going to lie about it tonight at the presidential debate. And they just let him get away with it. I want to know where these CNN fact checkers that are like, oh, this is completely false. It's an outright lie. It's just totally missing. It's egregious.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is Hunter Biden's wild personal life might actually be what's saving Joe Biden from the story having doing more damage to his campaign, because it has forced the Republican Party, not forced, but it's pushed them to focus so much on Hunter, and it's pushed the media to focus so much on Hunter. Like, what a lot of people are seeing are these leaked pictures of him from the hard drive, and it takes the focus off of Joe Biden, who is, the allegations here are corruption on Joe Biden's behalf.
The focus wasn't on Joe Biden for a second, though. The focus was on COVID and Orange Man bad. So it's certainly good for the Trump campaign to be talking about how Joe Biden's crackhead son is selling out this country to make money on the side. And, Joe Biden's been in the swamp for a very long time, decades and decades, so long that he once had positions I agreed with. Joe Biden's the kind of guy, take a look at him. He was known as middle-class Joe. He took the train. It's actually kind of expensive, from Delaware. He never made a lot of money. He has two really beautiful houses, one in D.C. and one in Delaware. And you can't tell me that he possibly made all of that on two books that he did, one of which, like, Saagar tripled the sales on. Good job. Where did that money come from? Book deals are lucrative for presidents and stuff, but for vice presidents, I don't know, maybe a little bit less. For Joe Biden, maybe a little bit less. Still a marquee project, but not the kind of thing he was living. So his money is coming from somewhere. Speeches could be a large part of it, but he's been in politics mostly. He hasn't quite left this arena. I'm wondering where the heck that money came from. I am also wondering if he's going to come out and throw Hunter under the bus. He's loath to do so. Hunter is his surviving son, and everyone who's had a family member or a loved one with addiction problems understands it can be very difficult, but you have to like go through it and not forsake your son. But I'm also wondering, like, his only real rational defense here would be, Hunter, it looks like my son was struggling with addiction. He had a disease, and he was running people for money in his name and my name, and I knew nothing about it, and I'm sorry, and I'm glad he's dealt with that. It's the equivalent of taking money out of your mother's purse to go get smack, which I have never done.
But that's the thing.
Cigarettes,
he can't do it because he's already boxed himself in the corner. He's already of the position. Hunter did nothing wrong. Any of the accusations that we just talked about here, which are matters of public record and fact, he says are just false. And this is where the media come apart. They're not going to call him on it. So why should he give a shit?
They are his campaign. They're not
they are. They just don't care.
And the other reason he can't turn around and just be like, oh, yeah, Hunter's bad is because the big
everyone knows Hunter's bad.
Yeah.
Big tech for me to have already come to their defense. So he would basically be getting the entire, the entire Pickett's charges.
So then he's corrupt, is the answer to that. It's either, and also speaking to his self-discipline and his sense, I understand that a father's love is blinding, and a brother's love is blinding, and a husband or a wife's, but
he knows
when you've got a friend or family member who's addicted to alcohol, for example, you don't drink a glass of wine around them at Christmas. Like you don't invite them to dinners where there's going to be heavy drinking because it's going to be difficult for them. If you have a son who's addicted to crack, you don't bring them to China and let them loose with businessmen, and you don't let them go play with Ukrainian oligarchs. Like this is so stupid and such poor behavior, and it's unsurprising at all that this person Hunter became and pulled into it. And so now the real question is, how corrupt is Joe Biden?
Yeah, that gets to a key point here, which is I actually think they sometimes make a mistake by going after his drug use. Here's the key, right? There are a lot of people who voted for Trump, by the way, whose sons and daughters and others have these same drug problems. But guess what?
Most American families have it.
Yes. Those people get locked up. Those people go to jail for petty crime, and those people don't have family connections, which enable their addictions for 50 plus years and use their connections to get them out of scrapes like in the military, or when he left his car keys in a rental car, whenever, and they found a crack pipe and the police were called. I mean, these people don't have the same level of access and don't have their kids trading off of their family names to fund their addictions and all of the other predilections that kind of come with that. I think that's the key, which is that this is the story of an elite kid who's smoking crack, who, if he was any other buddy's son, he would have been to jail 2 or 3 times.
Al Gore's kid got in trouble for smoking weed.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the key, which is we know that Hunter would not have gotten away with it if he was anybody else's son, and I think that is what anybody should be outraged about. It's just it's a 2-tiered system of justice.
You've never walked into a strip club and said, "Give me the Hunter Biden special."
Oh, God,
just asking. Saagar's a very proper individual. He would never do that. True. Emily, however.
I mean, I can't count how many times I've done that. Not on one hand. All right, to bring things all together here, I'm interested in, I think one of the most interesting parts of this entire election is that you have a candidate like Donald Trump who literally said in 2015, 2016, and he doesn't talk about this so much anymore. He'd say, I know the system. I've given money to politicians to get political favors. I know the system. And then you have Joe Biden over here, who really has also used the system and exploited the system, denying it. And as we're kind of marinating in this environment and this climate heading on into November 3rd, I think, people in the corporate media, people in the Acela corridor and in coastal enclaves they underappreciate the impact that this is having on voters who may pull the lever for Trump or frankly stay home. And that, I think this has been a helpful conversation to that point. So Saagar,
I hope so.
Although the term marinating sounds so much more peaceful than I feel like the current moment is. I would much prefer it like a nice soak. Get ready for the grill.
Yeah, we're in the hot tub of 2020. Saagar, thanks so much for being here. Chris, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
On Rising from Hill TV. You can listen to his podcast, Realignment, which is also on YouTube. It's a great podcast. I highly recommend you check it out. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinksy, culture editor here at the Federalist. We will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.